In church, I have the privilege of preaching tonight. We're going to be in Exodus chapter 23. Last week we looked at almost 3 chapters, and this week we're going to look at a whole 3 verses. So it'll be a different pace for tonight's text. We're going to be continuing in Exodus, like I said, 23 verses 10 to 12. And I'm excited because I get to talk about rest. I feel like rest is one of those kind of in vogue Christian topics. I don't know if you guys have experienced that sometimes a certain topic is going to be really popular to talk about, and there'll be blogs and podcasts and books written on this topic. And I think rest is one of those things that's popular, particularly because we live in a culture where people often get caught in these fast-paced cycles of life where they're going, doing. And so the idea of rest is novel and enticing. And we're going to be talking about that, but maybe from a different angle than I think it is typically discussed. But before we dive into the text, I wanted to ask if you guys ever have trouble getting to sleep in a new place. If you ever have trouble resting when you're not at home. I've found, particularly when I'm like at a hotel or at a friend's house, I can't ever sleep. Doesn't matter how comfortable the bed is, doesn't matter what temperature the room is. If it is a new place, I'm not going to sleep well the first couple of nights that I'm there. There are different sounds that I hear at night. You know, the light hits you differently in the hallway, or it's just hard to rest in a uncomfortable environment. I think part of that is this issue of anxiety, right? Like, I'm not afraid of anything, but I don't know what that sound was. Like, this isn't my neighborhood. Those aren't the cars that usually drive by at 2 a.m. It's just these things that can prevent you from resting when you're not comfortable, when you don't necessarily feel safe. Well, tonight we're going to talk about the importance of rest, what it really means, and even our call to provide rest for others. So like I said, we'll be in Exodus chapter 23, and just to kind of recap where we've been in the book of Exodus, this is the story of God liberating his people from slavery in Egypt and beginning this journey of taking them to the promised land. It begins with the Israelites in slavery in Egypt. They're enslaved to this oppressive empire that is forcing them to work, killing their children. It's a truly dire situation, and they cry out to God, and he hears and responds by sending Moses and a whole bunch of plagues. You've seen the movies, to get them out of Egypt and bring them to this land that he has promised them. Now, on their way to this promised land, they stop at the mountain of Sinai, where the Israelites meet God. He appears before them in a storm of fire and thunder and a voice that shakes the mountain, and it terrifies the people of God so much they say, "Please, Moses, don't let God talk to us anymore. Rather, you go up to talk to him." And so this is after they've been invited to keep God's covenant. Moses ascends to the top of the mountain, and this passage tonight is part of this law, these commandments that God gives to Moses to give to the people of God, to teach them how to be his people, to teach them how the people of God are supposed to live. See, there's this idea that we see in this passage, in these passages, about how God's character is reflected through the behavior of his people. You can tell what kind of God is based off of how he calls his people to act. Right? But if we study these laws that he gives us, we know what he values, what he hates, who he wants to protect, what he wants to penalize. It's kind of like how with a company, you can kind of tell something about the CEO based off of the rules that a company has. Or if you meet someone's children, you might get a good vibe, a good picture of what that person is like. It's that same idea. We can tell who God is based off of what he calls his people to be. And so we get this list of commands he gave his people to tell them how to be his people in the land that he is taking them to. And in these 3 verses in particular, we see this idea of rest. We see that God's people are called to reflect the rest-giving nature of God. They're called to give rest just like he does. So let me pray, and then we'll dive right into the text. Dear Lord, I'm so thankful for your goodness to us. I'm so thankful that you have given us your word through which we can come to know you. that you have moved in history in a way that has helped us to see who you are and how you act, that you have revealed yourself through your beautiful creation that testifies to your goodness. But Lord, I thank you most for the fact that you have revealed yourself through the person of Jesus Christ. And that through him and in him, we can know you in a way that is powerful and transformative. I pray that as we read your text tonight, we would see you in it and love you more. I pray all these things in your son's name. Amen. So let me read Exodus 23, verses 10 to 12. For 6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its yield. But the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, that the poor of your people may eat, and what they leave, the beasts of the field may eat. You shall do likewise with your vineyard and with your olive orchard. 6 days you shall do your work, but on the 7th day you shall rest, that your ox and your donkey may have rest, and the son of your servant, woman, and alien may be refreshed. Awesome. I'm sure that's all of your life verses. I'm sure that's the one that you have monogrammed on a pillow at home. We all love to talk about those two sets of verses in particular. See, what we see here in this text are these instructions for these rituals of rest, this call that God has for his people to give rest to the weary. He begins with these commands about this Sabbath year. For 6 years you shall sow your land and gather its yield, but the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, that the poor of your people may eat. He gives these agricultural commands, saying that with your fields, you should have them on a 7-year rotation, where for 6 years you'll be working your fields, you'll be getting the olives or the grapes or the barley from those fields, and on the 7th year, you'll not grow anything on that field. You'll leave it alone, you'll release it, set it free. Now, this wasn't supposed to be an annual year where nothing was grown, but rather a staggered occurrence where there would always be approximately 1/7 of the fields of Israel not growing crops. And when I read that, my first thought was, is this like an agricultural thing? Is this like crop rotation? But I don't actually think that's what is in view here. It wasn't to grow better crops, although that may have been a consequence. It was rather to care for the poor in their community. See, on every year, on average, 1/7 of Israel's fields was supposed to be available for the poor to go and eat from. This was a program designed to make sure that those who had the least would always have something. And even if the poor did not eat from those fields, they were instructed to leave it to the beasts, leave it to the wild animals. Don't even go back after the poor get their share. You leave this field so that those who don't have can have food, can have life here with these people. And he sets this up into the same kind of Sabbath pattern that God established at creation, right? This 6 parts and then 1 part. In the book of Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 to 3, we see this idea first introduced. Chapter 1 describes God creating the world in 7 days, or in 6 days, and then on the 7th day he rests. Let me read Genesis 2, verses 1 to 3. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the 7th day, God finished his work that he had done and rested on the 7th day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. It's this 6 parts something, 1 part something else pattern. We see the same idea in a chapter we talked about last week, chapter 21, verse 1, with this rule for slavery. The slaves would be set free on the 7th year. They would have 6 years of labor, and then on the 7th year, they would be set free. And this pattern, this Sabbath pattern, points towards the finished work of God. He completed his work of creation in 6 days, and then he finished it. He stopped, he rested. He didn't need rest. God doesn't tire, but the Sabbath marked this completed work of creation. It's like when you have a really busy season at work and you finish that season and you take a day off. Like you're done, you can rest, you can stop. And so God implemented this Sabbath system for the fields to show mercy for those who could not provide for themselves. Now, I love that word mercy. Often when we hear it, we think about mercy on someone who's guilty. Right? If you've done something wrong and you withhold punishment, I've heard that described as mercy, and that's a valid definition. But one definition that I really like is this idea of goodness towards those who are suffering. It doesn't ask why they're suffering. It doesn't ask how they got there, what they did or didn't do to put themselves in this situation. But it says, I'm going to show goodness to you simply because you are suffering. And the mercy of God is the backdrop to so many of these commands in the Torah, this idea that God wants his people to show mercy towards those who do not have or cannot advocate for themselves. Right? We saw rules last week about not lending at interest or establishing legal rights for the poor or prohibiting the taking of bribes, these laws that protected those who could not protect themselves. See, God wanted his people to be merciful towards the poor and the powerless, so he gave them this command that every 7 years their fields would be left for the poor to eat from. And then we see this commandment about this Sabbath day. He says in verse 12, 6 days you shall do your work, but on the seventh day you shall rest, that your ox and your donkey may have rest, and the son of your servant woman and the alien may be refreshed. It's a command for 1 day a week when everybody takes off so that they can memorialize the finished work of God. A day of rest to reflect on the fact that God finished his work. We saw this commanded in Exodus chapter 20 back when Pastor Mark was preaching through the 10 Commandments. It says this in Exodus 20 verses 8 to 11. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work. You or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For 6 days the Lord made, in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. God made it very clear that nobody was supposed to be working on this Sabbath day. It was supposed to be a day of rest holy to the Lord. Now, later in the book of Exodus, we'll get even more details on how to observe this Sabbath, but that's a different sermon. I actually think I'm preaching that one too. So you'll have to hold on tight. I think it's, I don't know how long, months in the future, after Christmas at the very least. So what we see here in this chapter, in chapter 23, is actually an expansion on this Sabbath command that we got back in the 10 Commandments. It adds a little bit of a spin, or it adds a little different focus or emphasis. See, the focus in chapter 23 is not just on taking a day off, but on making sure that those least likely to be able to rest will get that weekly rest. Right? It emphasizes animals, slaves, and foreigners, immigrants, those who are not native to the land. See, these people were the ones who had to work when the boss man said work. Right? They didn't get to set their schedules. They didn't get to choose to take a day off. And it would be so easy for the one who was in charge to say, I'm going to take off my Sabbath. You guys go and tend to my crops. You're not even from here. Who else are you going to work for? It would be easy to exploit these people. And so God made it clear that they would get their Sabbath. He even emphasized that it was so that they would be refreshed. He didn't want his people to subject others to the kind of abuse they suffered in Egypt. Back in Egypt, when Moses went to Pharaoh to ask for God's people to have freedom to go and worship God, Pharaoh not only said no, he increased their workload. He made it harder and harder for them to work so that they despaired. And God wants his people to be different than that. See, the purpose of these commands that we see here, both the command to a Sabbath year and the command to a Sabbath day, was to protect the poor and the marginalized. The focus isn't on their need for rest necessarily, it's on their responsibility to provide rest for others. The poor can rest from their worries because there are fields dedicated to provide food for them. The immigrant gets a day off each week to rest from working in someone else's field. Even the animals get a break. God is making sure that everyone gets to experience rest. Jesus highlights this idea in Mark chapter 2. He says that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. He's having this conversation about what is lawful to do on this Sabbath day and what is not. And he makes the point that the Sabbath's purpose was to provide rest for people, not to be this impossible to hold up standard. It was rather to give them rest. It was supposed to be a gift, an invitation to rest. We have labor laws in our modern day that are designed to protect people's rest, right? You can only work so many hours a week at a certain job. You can't work until you're a certain age. These were laws designed to protect people, and that's what this Sabbath command was. It was a command to protect the rest of God's people. And these commandments harmonize, I think, the horizontal and vertical dimensions of the law. Right? Often we talk about laws being horizontal concerning your worship of God, or vertical concerning your worship of God, and horizontal concerning your love for people. And even when we talk about the Ten Commandments, we'll kind of look at the first table, the first four that are about God, and then the second table, the six that follow that are about people. And they always talk about the Sabbath as one of those ones that's about God, but I think it's both. I think this combines them. It's supposed to be a day set aside for worship of God, where you can rest and think about God, but it's also supposed to be a day where you care for your neighbor by protecting their rest. He gives these commandments to remind his people both to worship and to show mercy. And so we see these two commands, this command for a rest for a field every seventh year, a command for rest for everyone every seventh day. And these commands are a reflection of God. They reflect the rest-giving character of God. But before we talk more about that, I think we should just talk about rest in general. Why is it that we need rest? I would argue that we do need rest and that it's actually a good thing. See, I think the biggest reason we need rest is because we are not God. I know that's not groundbreaking or surprising to anyone that I would say that. We are not God. God is infinite. He never tires. He's never weak. He's never weary. There is nothing that is too hard for him. Right? The theological term we use is omnipotent, all-powerful. There is nothing God cannot do. We are not like that. I get tired all the time. We get tired. We have limits. We need rest. And this isn't a bug. This is a feature. This isn't a problem with humanity. It's how we were designed. We were created to be dependent on God. You know, sometimes I think when we think about maturity, when we think about an adult growing to maturity, or a child growing to adulthood, growing to maturity, we think about independence. This idea that every year a child will need their parents a little bit less until they go off into the world and they have their own home, their own future, they pay their own bills. But the idea of Christian maturity is different. Christian maturity is not moving away from dependence on God. It's moving more and more into dependence on God. It's not needing him less every day. It's needing him more and more and relying on him more and more. The picture of maturity is childlike faith, this leaning into relying on God, and rest is a part of that. Taking a break, stopping, is a part of dependence on God. You see, we need rest because we are not infinite. We're not omnipotent. We're not the God of the universe, and that's a very good thing. We will always need to rely on God. So we need rest to remind us that we're not God, but we also need rest to help us memorialize God's faithfulness, to remember God's faithfulness. I use that word memorialize because I think it's better than just remember. It's talking about this idea of adopting practices that remind us of something important. Right? We have memorials to wars where we remember the sacrifice that the veterans of those wars made to win those wars. Or at someone's death, as part of the funeral, there'll be a memorial service where we remember their lives, who they were, the impact that they made. We need to memorialize the faithfulness of God. We need to have practices and rituals that remind us of his faithfulness. This is actually what the rituals and festivals that we see in the book of Exodus were about. We're going to read about that next week, but things like Passover or the Festival of Booths were reminders of God's faithfulness to his people. Today in the church, we have baptism and the Lord's Supper as these regular reminders of who God is, of his faithfulness to his people. And rhythms of rest can be a reminder that God will faithfully finish his work. See, rest forces us to trust that he will keep his promises. Have you guys ever been in a group project with an unreliable partner? I remember in college, I had to do this group project with this girl. I was excited at first that we were going to be working together. I knew her. She was a Christian. We'd done some ministry stuff together. And she stopped responding to my group's texts and emails like a week into the project. And it was like a big project. And she just didn't respond. And I talked to her about it. She's like, oh, I'm going to get back to you. A couple weeks later, she drops the class, never lets me know. The definition of unreliable when it comes to a group project. Well, that was anxious and stressful, right? I couldn't rest knowing that she might not do her part of the job. God is the opposite. He is the opposite of unreliable. He is a reliable God, and we can trust him to carry his into the couch. We can trust him to do the work he has promised that he is going to do. I had a pastor once of a big mega church in a meeting with some church planters give us the advice to take a 20-minute nap every day as a reminder to yourself that God is sovereign. Right? We're so tempted to think that we are the ones who determine whether we succeed or fail in what we do. We are the ones who provide for ourselves, but the reality is it's God. He is our loving Father who provides for us. He determines the success or failure of our mission, and we can trust him. You can take a nap because God is in control. We need to remind ourselves, we need to force ourselves to remember that God will be faithful, that his faithfulness is sufficient in our lives. He finished creation. It only took him 6 days and he made everything, and then he could rest. He will provide for your needs. He will accomplish redemption. See, genuine rest comes from knowing that God is on the throne. Have you guys ever been on a stressful vacation? Right? It was supposed to be a break. It was supposed to be relaxing, and now it's not. No, you're not at work, but you are more stressed than if you were there. Maybe it's the person that you're there with. Maybe it's the things that are happening. I think we've had this experience that a day off that was supposed to be relaxing ends up being stressful. See, you need more than just to stop work to actually rest. You need more than just a break from your day job to actually be resting. True rest only comes from the knowledge that God is on the throne, that he loves you, and that he will provide for you. Right? It's like a child in their parents' arms, crying and fearful until they're picked up by this loving, protective parent that they know everything's going to be okay. We can rest when we know that God is in control. That's why these ideas of the Sabbath being for worship and being for rest aren't competing ideas. It's not like you stop worshiping when you start resting, or you stop resting when you start worshiping. They're actually connected. To truly rest, you need to worship. You need to recognize who God is, that he is in control of your life, and that he is the reason that you can rest. He's the reason that you can relax and let go and trust. See, God is the one who grants true rest. He is the one who gives rest to his people. We see this in the story of the Bible. God creates a perfect world for his people to live in. He gives them these regular rhythms of rest and of worship. He frees them from slavery and oppression in Egypt so that they can rest in the promised land. That is who God is. And he will ultimately bring rest at the end of the story of history. See, when history culminates, God will have a paradise with his people. When he is returned in judgment and made all things new, he will grant rest. Hebrews 4 talks about this promised rest of God. It describes it as a Sabbath rest for the people of God that remains for us to enter into. That is the future, paradise with God forever. These Old Testament Sabbaths point towards a future Sabbath where God's people will rest with him for eternity. It's this picture of life on the other side of sin and death. That's what God gives to his people. That's his character. That's why in Psalm 4, David says, "In peace I will both lie down and sleep, for you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety." What is it that keeps you up at night? Is it finances? Is it fear of the safety of your community? Is it whatever you heard on the news tonight? I think the evening news is a terrible idea. You should not watch the news before trying to go to sleep. Whatever these things are that keep you from a restful sleep, you can let go and trust God because he makes you lie down in peace. He allows you rest. If we know that we are kept by the God of the universe, who is always faithful, who always finishes what he starts, we can rest. And so these commands that we see in Exodus 23 reflect the rest-giving nature of God. You see, regular rest is a critical need that God calls his people to provide for each other. So it's not just something that you need or something that you should seek out, but it's something that you owe other people. You have a responsibility and obligation to provide rest for others. We are called to be rest givers, they are called to keep the Sabbath for themselves and for their neighbors. They're called to choose the welfare of the poor over greater profit. They could make more money if they worked their fields all 7 years, right? They could have more resources, but God says, no, on the 7th year, you will care, you will show mercy towards others. It's a call to trust that God will provide exactly what they need. God's people reflect his character by providing rest for the weary. So when you help someone else rest, you're imitating God, right? You are like a child imitating their parent. When you provide rest for others, you are being like God. And when you prevent others from resting, you are working against his plan. See, the ultimate example of one who gives rest is Jesus Christ. In Jesus, we see restoration for the weary. This is the final point. See, Jesus is the fulfillment of these Sabbath commands. In Matthew chapter 5, it talks about how Jesus does not come to abolish the law, he comes to fulfill it. And even these commands for Sabbath years and Sabbath days are fulfilled in Christ. See, Jesus kept the entirety of the law. He never sinned. He never once broke a command of God. He fulfilled all the requirements of holiness, but he actually fulfills the purpose of the law as well. You see, everything that the people of God were called to be and do is fulfilled in Jesus Christ. And this is especially true for these Sabbath commands. Actually, in the Gospels, Jesus gets in trouble a few times for doing things on the Sabbath that the religious leaders thought he wasn't supposed to do. They're like, everybody's supposed to take the day off, but Jesus keeps on healing people. He wouldn't take a break from working miracles. In Mark chapter 3, right after that passage we talked about earlier with the Sabbath being for man, Jesus on the Sabbath heals the hand of a man whose hand was withered, who couldn't use his hand. This man was crippled. And on the Sabbath day, Jesus heals him, and that makes some people angry. They're like, how dare you heal this guy on the Sabbath? But I think he fulfills the purpose of the Sabbath. He doesn't just provide rest for this man, he provides restoration. He restores his withered hand. He brings lifelong suffering to an end. He gives him better than a day off. He gives him new life. That's the purpose of the Sabbath. And we see this rest-giving nature of Jesus most clearly through his death and resurrection. See, all people are under the penalty of sin and death. We have each sinned. We've each done what we know is wrong, what God has commanded that we not. And we are destined to die and are cut off from God as a consequence of our sin. This is an unliftable burden. No matter how hard we try, we cannot justify ourselves. We cannot make ourselves holy. But Jesus took the penalty for sin and death upon himself on the cross. He became sin who knew no sin. He had never done anything wrong, and yet he died on the cross bearing the burden of sin that was rightfully ours. And God raised him from the grave, announcing his victory over sin and death, so that now by faith we can share in his death to sin and his resurrection to new life with God. That is how we find true rest. This burden of sin that we have been under, this burden of death that we cannot escape, we can put down because Jesus paid for it on the cross. He invites us to experience true rest in him. I want to read Matthew 11:28-29. This is right after Jesus discusses how God has given him authority to invite people to find life. He says this, "Come to me all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Jesus invites the weary to find rest in him. He offers a yoke that is easy and a burden that is light. You see, life is different when you're a child of God. Your problems look smaller when you compare them to the power of God. Your future is brighter when you have hope in Jesus. Things are different if you're God's child. So what is it that you're carrying? What's the burden that is too heavy for you today? Is there something with your marriage? Do you have fears about the future? Is there a problem with your parenting, with your child? Is there something at work that is causing you anxiety? You can give it to Jesus. He provides rest. You can trust that he who has been faithful in the past will be faithful again. Jesus will provide a Sabbath rest for the people of God. He has made a way for us to be reconciled to God, and he will bring eternal peace to his people. So what's the point? We should reflect God by giving rest to the weary. We should be a rest-giving people. We should spend our time and energy to make sure that those in our community can rest. As I was thinking of examples, because that feels kind of abstract, it feels kind of hard to really understand. As I was trying to think of examples, the first people that popped into my mind were the chapels. Evan and Kathleen, whenever they know that I'm in a busy season, they will make meals for me. And they taste good too. Like it's actually a gift. And that's just a simple way that they are providing me with rest. They're giving me a bit of a break that I wouldn't have had otherwise. I think volunteering in our children's ministry is a great way to provide rest. We have a lot of parents who are involved in our church, some who don't get a break from their kids that often. So if you serve in that ministry downstairs, not only do you get to make disciples of the kids that are down there, but you also get to provide a break for their parents to be able to be here, fully engaged and invested in learning about the God of the universe. That's like perfect. That's a perfect fulfillment of this, right? Because they're getting that worship and that rest. If you're married, maybe you can give your spouse a night off. Maybe you can think about what that looks like to create spaces and rhythms and times for them to rest. We should be a community that looks out for ways to provide rest for each other. We should pursue activities that allow other people to take time off. This is especially true if you're in a position of authority. If you're a boss or an employer, you need to protect the rest of the people underneath you. Bosses, teachers, parents. You need to be Christ-like in your management of their time. Protect their opportunities to rest. Don't overwork them or force them to work in a way that is restless. But I also think we need to think about this from a communal perspective. We should work to build a society where the weary can find rest. The reflection of God's character should shape the way that we live and engage in our community. I try not to get political because I don't know anything about politics. I'm not advocating a policy or a platform or a person, but I think when we engage in politics, part of our motivation should be to provide rest for others, right? We should think, what can I do to build a society where our neighbors can take a break, where they are not weary or oppressed like the Israelites were in Egypt? The welfare of your neighbor should matter to you. But ultimately, I think, and most importantly, we need to invite the weary to find rest in Jesus. The only genuine true rest can be found in Christ. They need to have peace with God through Christ so that they too can put down their burdens and rest in a way that is life-giving, refreshing, and transformative. So we need to make our mission to invite the weary to rest in Jesus, to tell them of his gospel so that they too can rest.